Listen to the 48 Hours podcast for shocking murder cases and compelling real-life dramas from one of television's most watched true crime shows. Go behind the scenes of each episode with award-winning CBS News correspondents and producers in Postmortem, a weekly deep dive. Listen to 48 Hours wherever you get your podcasts.
Girl, real talk. This whole it's a new year, time to reinvent myself trash is not the vibe for 2024. You can find someone who loves you for you, as you are. You don't need to read a stack of self-help books, only eat sad salads, or start meditating at 5 a.m. to be ready for dating. So yeah, my advice is to download Bumble and find someone who embraces you the way you are right now. Let me know how it goes.
A note to listeners, the following podcast contains content that may not be suitable for all audiences. Discretion is advised.
The way I got involved in this, I had been writing and producing documentary films for this PBS science series Nova. After I'd read Silence of the Lambs and heard a movie about it was coming out, I said to the executive producer, Paula Apsell, look, I read this book. I think it's really good and done very well. And if the movie is half as good, I think it's going to be a big hit. I had no idea how big a hit it was going to be. I said, why don't you let us go to Quantico, to the FBI Academy, and see if we can tease out the real story behind Silence of the Lambs, what really happened. This is what separates these guys out from the rest of the world, is they have no empathy. Don't consider other people human beings. They're just objects to be used for their own narcissistic purposes.
You are listening to Partners in True Crime. We are your hosts, Rob and Cindy Dorfman.
Welcome back to The Killing Hour with Doc Bonn. In 1988, Thomas Harris published his best-selling novel, The Silence of the Lambs, which then became a blockbuster movie starring Jodie Foster and Anthony Hopkins.
The film gave the world a new perspective on serial killers and how law enforcement studies them and catches them. But that was fiction. In 1995, the book Mindhunter, Inside the FBI's Elite Serial Crime Unit, was published. The authors, world-renowned FBI criminal profiler John Douglas and documentarian and writer Mark Olshaker, revealed the real stories behind some of the world's most infamous serial killers.
The book eventually became a hit television series, further supporting Doc Bonn's theory and book on why we love serial killers. Today, we are happy to have one of the authors of Mindhunters here with us, Mark Olshaker, to hear his insights about serial killers.
First off, I just want to thank you for being on the podcast, Mark Olshaker. And if you want to tell us, if you can just give us a little short bio of your work and your expertise.
I am a writer and a documentary filmmaker by trade. I'd written 4 or 5 novels and published them before I got started in any of this. But as a novelist and as a documentary filmmaker, I'm always interested in about why people do the things they do, what we generally call the human condition. And the thing about crime, true crime, if you will, is that it's all about the human condition. It's all about the normal things we all feel: love, hate, jealousy, revenge, greed, whatever. And yet it's at the extremes. It's the human condition writ large. It's all the things that we feel and fear, but most of us don't do. Most of us have the self-control not to do, or the intelligence, the emotional intelligence not to do. Some people don't, and that's what people like Scott from a very academic perspective and me from kind of a pop culture perspective do. And the way I got involved in this, I had been writing and producing documentary films for this PBS science series Nova, and after I'd read Silence of the Lambs and heard a movie about it was coming out, I said to the executive producer, Paula Apsell, look, I read this book. I think it's really good and done very well. And if the movie is half as good, I think it's going to be a big hit. I had no idea how big a hit it was going to be. I said, why don't you let us go to Quantico, to the FBI Academy, and see if we can tease out the real story behind Silence of the Lambs, what really happened. And at first she was a little skeptical. It was soft science, it was psychology, but I finally convinced her. And this was before 9/11. It was before security became very heavy. It was before serial killers became a thing, or a meme, if you will. And the FBI was very happy to cooperate. We went out there, my partner Larry Klein and I, and we interviewed people. We kind of talked it out, and we started following the investigative support unit of the behavioral science section. And we came up with a film that I wrote and produced called Mind of a Serial Killer. It was nominated for a national Emmy and did very well on PBS. And then some months later, I guess it was, when John Douglas, the FBI's behavioral profiling pioneer and the head of the unit, he got ready to retire. He called me and said, "I'm getting ready to retire. Do you think anybody would be interested in my story?" And I said, "Well, I certainly am. Let's see who else is." So we went to New York with my agent. We presented to a couple of publishers, and there was kind of widespread acceptance. Perhaps the smartest thing I did was to name the book Mindhunter. I'm not sure how I came up with that, except that it had been mentioned, that the term had been mentioned in an old Psychology Today article, which Scott may remember since he writes for Psychology Today, about the FBI's Mind Hunters. So I thought, well, that sounds good. I'll call it Mindhunter. In any event, the book was bought by Scribner, division of Simon & Schuster. It became a big bestseller, so we just decided to keep going. And there were so many stories to tell. And the last book that John and I completed, When a Killer Calls, I think is about our 10th book together.
That's fantastic.
Wow, that's
it's fascinating. So John Douglas, when you first met him and when you went into that behavioral science lab at the FBI, were you surprised at anything that you saw?
Well, I've told this story a number of times. Everybody who we met with, and there were about 8 or 10 people in the room, everybody was very cordial and very enthusiastic, except for John, who I was meeting for the first time. He was really negative. He said, "I don't like dealing with reporters, and I don't like dealing with the media. I have to do it all the time, but they always get the story wrong, and this, that, and the other." And, I'm thinking, gee, who peed on his cornflakes this morning? But once we got going, he became very cooperative. I think he became convinced of our seriousness in what we were doing and our desire to tell the real story. And he became one of our biggest supporters, as witnessed by the fact that he approached me about working on a book with him.
It's great. It's awesome.
That is amazing.
Your book and your series that you've done with John, I mean, it's a phenomenon all over the world, and so much so that years later, Netflix picked up on it and had their own series, which has
right.
Become a phenomenon in and of itself. And I've wanted to ask you, what you think of the Netflix adaptation and series. Are you a fan? Is it accurate?
We're big fans. I mean, it's accurate in the larger sense, in that everything they talk about in terms of the process of coming up with behavioral science as the FBI practices and interviewing the incarcerated serial killers to be able to coordinate. And Scott, you and I have talked about this a number of times, to correlate what was going on in the offender's mind before, during, and after the offense. And so even though David Fincher, the executive producer and director, decided that the characters based on John Douglas, Robert Ressler, and Ann Burgess would be fictional characters with different names, it's very accurate. He's taken a lot of my actual dialogue in the series, and the offenders, the people who were interviewed in this serial killer study, people like Ed Kemper and Charles Manson, Jerome Brudos, they're all portrayed as themselves and look like themselves. It's kind of uncanny, and so we're very happy with the series, and we hope it goes into a third season.
Yeah, it seems like it's going to, from what I hear.
Please, God, cross your fingers.
Yeah.
Whatever.
That's great.
It's a great series.
Yeah, I know the actors are very anxious to do another season, so do three more seasons actually, which is what David originally scoped out.
Wow, the guy who played Kemper in particular is chilling. I mean, it's just, I feel like I'm watching Ed Kemper.
What's great about him though is, do you know what his job was before he became an actor?
No idea.
He was a preschool special education teacher.
Oh, geez.
That makes it even creepier.
That's even more creepy. Exactly.
Wow, that goes from the co-ed killer to the preschool killer.
Yeah, exactly. Well, exactly. And he's a great guy. They're all really nice people.
That's fantastic.
You see him from their characters.
I'm curious on how you started writing about BTK in the 90s before he even was caught. That's interesting to me.
Well, like many other characters who had come before John's investigative support unit in the behavioral science section, Wichita police asked the FBI to do a profile. And so John was involved, and we thought it was an unusual case in a lot of ways. And I know Scott's studied this, so he knows this too, in that this was somebody who had a real interest in communicating with authorities, with the police, even though he couldn't reveal himself, the recognition was obviously very important to him, to the point where he was upset. He felt put upon that the media and the police hadn't given him a really cool nickname. So he's the one who suggested BTK for bind, torture, and kill. And the other thing that was fascinating about BTK was he would commit a series of really heinous crimes, but then he'd lay low for a long time. And we generally think of serial killers as reaching kind of a boiling point, committing a crime, having a cooling off period, and then building up again. But this guy would sometimes go for years without committing a crime, to the point where the police thought, well, maybe he's dead, maybe he's moved to another jurisdiction, maybe he's in prison for something else and he hasn't been associated with this. And so when Dennis Rader was finally revealed years later as the BTK killer, there was a lot to try to understand. There was a lot to try to unpack about what kind of offender this was and what it meant in terms of behavioral science and trying to apply that to other potential cases.
What was were you working with John Douglas at that time when you discovered that?
Not when he did the original profile back, I guess it must have been mid-70s. So no, I wasn't involved in that part. By the time he was captured, John was out of the Bureau already, but did get to go interview him in prison and find out the thing that was most interesting and most significant to John, which is, all right, what about these big gaps between the crimes, and why did he go back to it? So that was probably the most important single insight into somebody like Dennis Rader. I will also mention that people think of these guys as, old, young, nocturnal loners, young males, whatever. This guy was middle-aged. He had a wife. He had 2 children. He had a job. So people were looking right through him. I mean, everybody was terrified of BTK in the Wichita, Kansas area, but they were looking right through Dennis Rader. He was also the president of his church for a while.
That's right. And Boy Scout leader.
That's right.
He was very benign, to the unsuspecting eye, without a doubt. I wanted to ask you, Mark, so John developed the original profile in probably the late 70s. I believe you were writing with John by the mid 90s.
Correct.
Do you remember at that time, since he was still unidentified and certainly hadn't been apprehended, what the original profile or what the characteristics that John and you were looking at that time?
Yeah, and most of them turned out to be pretty accurate. Well, one thing is John and his colleagues suspected this was either a police officer or a police wannabe. This was somebody who had a strong interest in being powerful, in being able to impose rules on people, and most likely he was a police officer, an ex-police officer, or somebody involved in some type of law enforcement. Mm-hmm. Now, it turns out he was, I don't even know what you'd call it, but he was kind of a municipal compliance officer. He would drive around and make sure people's lawn was not too long, that their dogs weren't running free, things like that. So yes, he was in law enforcement, but on a very low level, and apparently took his job very, very seriously and really got off on being able to find people or give them tickets or whatever. But because one of the things that he did was that we knew about was he was drawing elaborate pictures of the crime scenes. Now, some of them were after the fact. A lot of them turned out to be before the fact. So he was planning these. And what we found out afterwards, he considered these his projects. That's what he called them. So the thing that became important to know, and we can get to the gaps and why he stopped for a while in a moment. But what became important to us was to realize that despite his apparently happy marriage, despite his love for his 2 children, despite his job, despite his education, these murders, these crimes, these projects were the most important thing in his life. That's what he lived for. He was out cruising in his car, his official vehicle, daily and nightly, looking for people who he could do this with. This was the most important thing in his life. This is what he lived for.
Why do you think that he waited so long from when he finished his spree, I guess, in the 90s until 2000?
Well, this is the most interesting part. And this is what John speculated on, and a variation of it turned out to be true. John speculated that for him to, whoever BTK turned out to be, for him to wait so long between crimes, something must have happened that scared him. It turns out, after the fact, we found out that he was, not surprisingly, taking souvenirs from some of his victims. It's not unusual for serial killers to take, obviously, fetish items like underwear, jewelry, wedding rings, even things they can remember them by, like driver's licenses. Rader was taking clothing, all kinds of things. He was in the privacy, he thought, of his own home when he was alone. He was dressing up in women's clothing and practicing autoerotic asphyxiation, which is strangling yourself to the point that you get a high, almost to the point of passing out. A lot of people actually do die from this. And it turns out that his wife, who was a very innocent young woman, caught him at this and didn't associate him with BTK, but being a very, proper Utah girl, well brought up, she thought this was really weird and really sick and threatened that if he ever did it again, she would leave him. And he was afraid of this, and I think afraid of the fact that if she did leave him and reveal what he was doing, that would lead to his identification. And as I recall, Scott may remember better than I do, but as I recall, this happened twice. And that's what led him to these long periods where he didn't do anything. But then eventually the need for recognition, the need to communicate what he was doing, got the better of him. And as we all know, it was sending digital discs to the police and the media that eventually got him caught.
What was some of the things that John Douglas shared with you about his meeting with BTK?
Well, I think the most important thing is that it was all very matter of fact. Rader didn't deny anything. He didn't go into sort of a trance of remembering and going back into that era like some of the incarcerated offenders did. It was all very matter of fact. Yeah, this is what I did. He didn't seem to have any particular remorse for any of it, certainly. If he had any remorse, it was that he got caught and was sort of tricked into revealing his identity. But I think, to go back to the phrase that Hannah Arendt used in her very controversial book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, I think what John saw was the absolute banality of evil. I mean, this was a totally ordinary guy. And what distinguished him in his own mind was his ability to create these, what he considered very artistic murder scenes.
Crazy.
The late profiler, Roy Hazelwood, I got to know pretty well, a terrific guy before he passed away.
Yes, he was.
And he told me that in his interactions with BTK, that he really felt that he was the most profound and chilling psychopath that he ever sat with. And that, includes he also interviewed, with John and without John, the most infamous of all time. Would that be consistent with what John and you observed as well?
I would think so, Scott, and partially because of this banality of evil. And Roy was the FBI's real expert on interpersonal violence. And he was, as you say, Roy was a great guy and a very perceptive profiler, as well as an excellent teacher. I took his profiling class at Quantico, and he was brilliant. Roy was also probably, this is going to sound strange, but Roy was probably the world's foremost expert on autoerotic asphyxiation and those kind of crimes, that kind of sexual paraphilia. And of course, this was one of Dennis Rader's primary means of sexual gratification. In fact, Scott, you mentioned that he had been a Boy Scout leader, and several times when he was out on overnight campings with Boy Scouts, he would go off and tie a rope to a tree and practice this on his own. So yes, I think the fact that I think what Roy was talking about, and I think he's right, is there was just so little human empathy, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, this is what separates these guys out from the rest of the world, is they have no empathy. They don't consider other people human beings. They're just objects to be used for their own narcissistic purposes. So yeah, I think just the absolute ordinariness of somebody who could do this is absolutely chilling, and does speak to the academic expert, so you might talk to us about the psychopathology involved. But yeah, I mean, it was absolutely apparent.
Roy also mentioned to me that he had never seen so many varieties of fetishism in one individual.
Yes.
From cross-dressing to sadomasochism, right, to, dolls and bondage, yep, on and on and on. He said he'd never seen so much in one person.
Yeah. Now, bondage was very important to him, as you know. But what was interesting is, I mean, we do have some really sick individuals, Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris, Leonard Lake and Charles Ng, for instance, people like that, who took great pleasure in inflicting physical pain on their victims and, in fact, recording it. I mean, these are the sickest of the sick. But what was the thing that was the particular fetish that Dennis Rader had was not physically harming his victims so much, although obviously he did. It was putting them in a position where they were helpless and knew they were going to die, and watching them do this, watching them be terrified, watching them die. That was his particular main fetish. And I think that's another reason why Roy Hazelwood probably said this is one of the most psychologically perverse people he had ever come across.
In fact, I mean, your point is so right on. In his first killings, the Otero family, he told me that he interacted with the daughter that he killed, Josephine. When he took her down in the basement and ultimately hanged her, he told her, very soon you're going to be going to heaven with mommy and daddy, who he had just killed upstairs.
I was going to mention that. In fact, I think he said something to the effect of, yes, don't worry, you'll be in heaven by dinner time, something like that.
That's right.
That's just chilling. It really is unnerving to hear some stuff.
And
like
of course, what this tells us again and again and again is that this is somebody who had absolutely no regard for other human beings. They were merely objects for his fantasies, for his desires. And what you have here, and again, I know this is something that Scott has had to deal with, is almost all of these guys, I would say all of them, and Dennis Rader is a perfect example. You've got two things psychologically warring within them. You have this deep-seated feeling of inadequacy, of not being up to life. And at the other warring with this, you've got this sense of entitlement and this sense of grandiosity, of being better than everybody else. And you triangulate that with the sense of resentment that nobody else realizes it. And you've got a very dangerous personality.
Really good point. And in fact, one of the things that I think led to his tipping point in 1974, where he actually committed his first murders, is he had been recently let go from Cessna, the aeronautics firm. And he, in fact, felt emasculated because Paula, his wife, was the breadwinner. And he had been out trolling and building, his fantasies the way he had for some time. But suddenly he was very unsettled, unhappy, as I said, felt emasculated. And I think that's one of the things that may have driven him to actually kill for the first time.
I suspect that's true. And again, when you kill a whole family, that shows how powerful you are. And if I remember correctly, Mr. Otero had been in the service. He was a very strong, fit, accomplished guy. So
a boxer. He actually was a boxer.
Yeah, so that made it even better.
Mm-hmm. And his wife, Julie, had studied judo. So these were not people who couldn't handle themselves. And he in one of his letters to me, it took him by surprise. He had been watching the Oteros and he really wanted the mother and the daughter, and he thought that they would be home alone. But it turned out that 4 of the family members were there. And he said, well, this was my first time out. I have my hit kit here, my bag of tools, and I didn't get all dressed up for nothing. So he just improvised on the spot. And that's consistent with his unflappable psychopathic nature. We're just going to continue here.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Does BTK Raider, did John tell you that he enjoyed his interaction with him when he met with him face to face? I mean, because he seems like he likes the attention.
That's hard to say. He gives the impression of being somewhat remorseful, but of course he's not. So no, I don't think John felt that he was either. I'm sure he was flattered by the attention, but the impression that he gave is, okay, you want to talk to me? Fine. It's matter of fact. What was particularly chilling to us, though, is and this was revealed to us by one of the first journalists that he interacted with after he was caught. John and I did a book, I believe it was Obsession. We had a case in the beginning that was kind of loosely based on BTK before Dennis Rader had been caught. We said that this was a made-up case and it was based on some real elements. When we gave a profile and explained why we thought certain things about this case we made up. Turns out Rader had read Obsession and he had annotated that chapter about what he thought applied to him and what he thought didn't. And so he eventually told John that he was pretty impressed by some of the insights we had. Some he thought we got wrong, which we don't agree with. But I think that's part of the ego. He was fascinated. He wanted to be called BTK. He wanted the recognition. And two authors were writing about him, or at least seemed to be.
He was a self-described student of the game. He studied it. He studied other serial killers as far back as Jack the Ripper. I remember him telling me.
And again, this was the most important. The reason he did this was the most important aspect of his life. The only thing that gave him true satisfaction.
It's so interesting. I hadn't thought about this for a while, but when I first wrote to Rader, which was I think it was 2010 when I was starting research for, my book, Why We Love Serial Killers. And I decided to sort of play Clarice Starling, from Silence of the Lambs in my letter, oh, great one, I can learn from you. And he picked up on it immediately. I think I got a letter back from him in 10 days from the time that I first wrote it.
And this is not unusual. When John interviewed David Berkowitz, the so-called son of Sam, he brought newspapers with him covering the crimes in the summer of 1977. And he said, David, years from now, no one's going to remember John Douglas. No one's going to remember Robert Ressler, but they're going to remember David Berkowitz, the son of Sam. He held up the newspapers and he said, so let's talk about it. Tell me about it. And of course, Berkowitz just opened up completely at that point.
Absolutely. Narcissism and egomania and psychopathy all wound together.
It's crazy. It's all very crazy and fascinating.
Do you think, we've talked about this before with Scott, but I'm just curious to see what you think with these types of individuals who lack empathy like this. Do you believe that they're just born with their brain is just missing that? Or is that something that happens as a result of their childhood? Because with BTK, we didn't really see that with him.
This is a very interesting question, and the whole issue of nature versus nurture runs throughout almost all of our books, because this is at the heart of, again, why people do the things that they do. And what we've observed over these many years and all of these offenders is that there's probably something hardwired in with a lot of them, something, I don't know if you'd call it organic or just inherent in their personality and their behavior. And then if you get in terms of development, if you have a really bad background, if you have really abusive parents or neglectful parents or something really traumatic that happens in the childhood, when you have this kind of susceptible personality, that's generally what does it. Look, we found over and over again that people who come from really bad backgrounds and become killers or rapists or other violent predators, very often they have brothers who came from the same kind of background. And most often they have sisters who virtually never go into that. Women seem to manifest abuse and bad backgrounds in different ways, taking it out on themselves more than others. So yeah, it's generally a combination of that. But having said that, coming from a really bad background, abusive or whatever, I can understand how that makes you a pretty messed up adult in a lot of ways, but it doesn't make you a predator. It doesn't make you a killer. There's nothing inherent in that says you have to hurt other people as a result. So, you can understand it, but you certainly don't excuse it.
Girl, real talk. This whole "it's a new year, time to reinvent myself" trash is not the vibe for 2024. You can find someone who loves you for you, as you are. You don't need to read a stack of self-help books, only eat sad salads, or start meditating at 5 a.m. to be ready for dating. So yeah, my advice is to download Bumble and find someone who embraces you the way you are right now. Let me know how it goes.
Inspired by the life of the savvy and ambitious Colombian businesswoman Griselda Blanco comes a new Netflix original limited series. Griselda tells the story of a devoted mother who, with her lethal blend of charm and relentless savagery, creates one of the most powerful cartels in history. Witness Sofia Vergara's captivating transformation into the godmother of the underworld. Griselda, streaming January 25th, only on Netflix.
Yeah, I still find it very fascinating how it's a male-dominated type thing. And
absolutely.
You have your random female serial killers. They're very few, but how so much it just comes back to that almost Neanderthal trait.
Absolutely. And Scott may want to comment on this, but what we always say is almost all of these predators are committing their crimes with chemical influence, and the chemical is testosterone.
Absolutely. And in some cases, but it's actually relatively rare, there is substance abuse. Like Dahmer was an alcoholic, but it's kind of rare because, as you said, the primary drug is the adrenaline rush.
And if you see substance abuse, it's usually to lower that final inhibition. You want to do it. Maybe you take drugs, maybe you drink, so that you lower that final inhibition. But again, it's not the drugs, it's not substance abuse that makes them do it. By the same token, it's not the pornography, as some of them, like Ted Bundy, have said it was. You can make the case that, yeah, these guys, if they see some very sadomasochistic pornography, they're influenced to act on it. However, by the same token, anybody who is not prone to that to begin with will not suddenly say, "Oh, wow, look at what I just saw. I'm going to do that." It doesn't work that way. I could make the case that some of these very violent video games may lower our the kids' threshold of sensitivity. But I don't think there's I haven't seen any evidence or data that it actually leads people who aren't already prone to commit these crimes. And by the same token, John has always said that if you're a child predator, you don't need to see child pornography pictures to be inspired. You can look at any children's clothing catalog and get off on it.
And which Rader did. He would collect cutouts and
yes, that's right.
And pictures of children in underwear and things like that. One of the things that I've thought about, and I wanted to get your insight on this, is he was in as much as he was, of course, a malignant narcissist and a sadist, there was also masochistic tendencies, autoerotic asphyxiation, and tying himself up and enjoying pain himself. That seems to me, or at least in my experience, is relatively rare among his ilk. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it is relatively rare. You see the sadism manifesting itself much more prominently. But I think in his case, it was also a question of control. I mean, he wanted to control other people. He wanted to control himself. And so I think there is a degree of masochism or sadomasochism in the autoerotic asphyxiation. I think he tied him, to the extent that he could, he tied himself up. But so I think this was a control fantasy as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And he told me, and Cindy and Rob and I have talked about this a bit, but I'd also like to get your thoughts on it. In his grandiosity, he thinks that the fact that he was able to sustain himself and pleasure himself through fantasies enabled him to have these long periods between killings, and society should in fact be grateful for that he discovered this, and because he might have killed many more than he actually did. So Dennis, thank you so much.
I completely agree that he was able to sustain himself with the fantasies. I don't give him any credit for that in terms of saving other people from his evil ways, but I firmly believe that as low an affect as he seems to present to people who interview him in prison now, I would be shocked if he didn't spend many nights fantasizing about all of the crimes that he had committed and all of the crimes that he still would like to commit. Shocked if that wasn't his main mental preoccupation.
Absolutely. In fact, he told me that these fantasies were like picture shows that were permanently, in his brain, like movies Absolutely. That he could watch again and again.
And that's what you find with these guys. It's a movie that unreels over and over and over again.
Do you think that his attempt or his use of autoerotic fantasy and this ability that he had to satisfy himself and have these long periods, between killings, do you think because he's such a control freak that this was in a way his ability to show, I do have control of this factor X. I do have control over this thing within me, and it doesn't control me. I mean,
I think that's possible. I think if so, it's misguided. You also have to remember that in a lot of these cases, at least the ones we know about, where he was caught committing autoerotic asphyxiation, he was also dressed as a woman. So I think he was, in a way, he was saying, look, I can do the whole show myself. I mean, I can be the one who strangles, who ties up. I can also be the victim. I don't need anybody else in a sense.
Fascinating.
What's really disturbing about all of this is that these people are living amongst us, as BTK exactly. was living this, as you said, banal, commonplace lifestyle, just like your ordinary guy. Is there any way in your discussions with John and your experience with this that people could identify someone like this in their life or prevent someone from doing stuff like this? Is that even possible?
It's very difficult. I mean, if you get these people early enough, and when I say early enough, I mean like school age, and there's profound intervention, sometimes they can be stopped. Somebody like BTK who could go long periods without doing anything, it's very difficult. Sometimes when you have somebody who's moving fairly quickly from one crime to another, it's possible to describe the post-offense behavior you might expect and have somebody who's close to them recognize it and turn them in, particularly if you can make it clear through the media that the person who knows about this, who's heard somebody talk, who's heard somebody even talk about it in the third person, could be very well in danger themselves. But what these guys are good at blending in, and they don't look like Frankenstein's monster. They, as we keep saying, you see right through them because they're so ordinary and banal most of the time.
Yeah, they're not all giants like Ed Kemper. It's like he's got a threatening, imposing figure because of his size.
And yet Kemper was brilliant at making people not be afraid of him. One of the things that I found fascinating about Kemper was when he would cruise looking for co-eds around the campus of the University of California, Santa Cruz to pick up, he'd stop and a girl who was hitchhiking and say, "All right, where are you going?" And she'd tell him, and he'd look at his watch and say, "Gee, I don't know if I have time." All right, okay, get in, I'll take you there. And so they were completely disarmed by his hesitation. Now, that's a violent, predatory murderer. Now, fast forward a couple of decades to somebody like Bernie Madoff, who committed no violent crime, but was scamming people out of literally tens of billions of dollars. People would come to him and say, "Bernie, so-and-so has invested money with you and he's making 10% a year. I'd like to get in on this deal." And Bernie would say, I'm not taking any new investors now. And they'd say, "Look, I'm a friend of so-and-so. You know, he said you would talk to me and you would let me invest with you." And he'd say, "All right, if you're a friend of so-and-so, all right, I'll take it. But look, don't bother me. Don't ask me anything. Don't ask me for your money back for 5 years. You'll get your dividends, but just leave me alone because I'm busy and I've got other things to do." So essentially, Madoff is doing the exact same thing as Kemper is for his own illegal, nefarious reasons. He's not killing people, but it's the same technique.
Yeah, it's
absolutely
the getaway closer mentality, you know?
Yeah.
Something that is true that not a lot of people realize is that not all psychopaths become the serial killers. Many of them become very successful in business through manipulation.
Yes, they're all in Hollywood.
I was going to say, they're all in Hollywood.
God, how many really successful business executives do not have some kind of borderline personality disorder?
Yeah.
So true.
Yeah.
So true.
Absolutely. Dealing with network executives, we know.
The question I had for you is, I wonder if you guys ever you and John talked about this with the rash of spree killings from these young men. Are these like a new wave of serial killers that have...
When you say spree killing, what
I'm talking about the mass shootings, you know,
that's a different, that's a different...
I'm using the incorrect term.
Spree killing and mass murder are
mass murder then. I'm sorry if I said it, but you know, the rash of mass killings of these young men who, when they're captured, and you know, most of the time they're killed, but when they're captured, they kind of fit that profile of someone who has been pushed down, marginalized, quote unquote, emasculated, either by society, by their peers that have... Is there any correlation to, like, if there wasn't such focus on that and copycatting of this, do you think that person would eventually become into a serial killer?
Not necessarily. Some would, some wouldn't. Now, there's certainly a connection in terms of this deep-seated sense of inadequacy warring with the sense of entitlement, and nobody understands or recognizes my worth. You find these in the so-called incels, involuntary celibates, over and over again. They wouldn't necessarily become serial killers. First of all, they're not set up for that. A serial killer is by very definition a successful killer, somebody who learns from what they're doing. They usually have some kind of ongoing program, like whether it's torture or recognition or whatever, like Dennis Rader had. Your mass murderer is generally playing an end game. He's making one large statement. By and large, they don't expect to get away. If they do, it's just the way things happen. The one exception I might make to that is racially motivated killers, like mass murderers like Dylan Roof, who figured whether he got away or not, eventually he would foment a race war and the white nationalists would come and release him, something I think he still thinks will happen. But by and large, I think there's a lot of copycatting. So many of these guys have studied Columbine to a very meticulous degree. The fact that it's so easy to get guns makes it very easy to do this. I mean, in other countries, you see some of these crimes with knives, very seldom in the United States. Usually it's AR-15 type weapons with large magazines. And so most of these guys, I think, don't expect to get away. They're playing an end game. And so a serial killer expects and desires to get away. I think a mass murderer is something else entirely.
Do you think Dennis Rader wanted to get caught?
Well, I think there's a real conflict there, which is no, I don't think he wanted to get caught, but he desperately wanted the recognition. So, how do you resolve those two things? It's an impossible resolution.
I totally concur with Mark on that. I don't think that he wanted to get caught. I think he desperately was missing the recognition. And when the article came out in 2004 saying, maybe he's dead, we haven't heard from him in so many years, he couldn't stand it. He had to get back into the game again. I think it's also too naive to say that he just got sloppy with the floppy disk because he's an intelligent guy. He had to have known that the technology could probably trace that. I think it was more that he actually believed that Ken Landwehr, the lieutenant who he had been corresponding with and playing Catch Me If You Can, that he and Ken had an understanding, had a relationship, that they were brothers in law enforcement as Rader viewed him, and so he thought that they had principles, that they were following a code.
Agree.
Yeah, a code of ethics. How could Ken lie to him? Ken, you're my partner. How could you lie to me?
That was the boy. That was the Boy Scout in him.
And Ken said, "I wanted to catch you." It was that simple.
Exactly.
So, yeah, I think, but I think what Scott brings up is these guys are so narcissistic, so into themselves, that it never occurs to them that all of their own crimes, if you will, including murder, torture, all kinds of things, that's okay, but that's part of the code. But somebody else on the other side is not going to violate this code of honesty because, as Scott says, they respect their opponent so much, which is nonsense, of course.
And Ken Landwehr, who, unfortunately passed away a little while back, said that his perception was that BTK, Rader, didn't want this game to go on forever. He couldn't believe that Ken didn't want to continue playing this game. That they were having so much fun together.
Yeah, and you found the same thing between David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, and the chief of detectives, Joseph Borelli. He had personified Joseph Borelli as his opposite number, and he essentially thought that they were playing the same game.
Mm-hmm.
What motivates that? What motivates that and drives that yearning for connection to your hunter?
I think it's recognition. I think it's most of these guys are police wannabes in some form. They want the power. They realize that somebody like Ken Landwehr or Joseph Borelli, they have the power, they have the recognition, so they want to associate themselves. It's the same, in a way, it's almost like the assassin personality, where the assassin wants to kill the object of his hunting, whether it's a presidential candidate or whether it's John Lennon, because that makes you just as powerful, if not more so, than the person who you envy.
It's like
Absolutely.
It's like a derivative of Stockholm syndrome, almost in a way. Like they're falling in love with their hunter, like someone who you wouldn't want to be in the same room with ever.
Well, I don't know if I'd agree with that, because Stockholm syndrome really involves victims who are held against their will, and in this case, we're not really talking about victims. So we're talking about two people on opposite sides of the law, but there may be something to it. I don't know. I'd have to think about it.
And of course, just in Rader's case and in most of these individuals, just the extreme narcissism that yes. Who wouldn't be interested in me? I'm the most interesting guy in the world, so why wouldn't Ken Landwehr be interested in me?
I completely agree with that.
That's great. So where do you think BTK sees himself? Does he see himself in the Parthenon and serial killers? Does he see himself at the top?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Scott, and I can ask you this too. Does he have a ranking system, or does he just think about himself and none of the others? Because I know you said he got a little jealous when you mentioned something about David Berkowitz.
Well, I would think he would get jealous when you mention anybody else.
Absolutely. And that is true. When Rader found out that I was also corresponding with Berkowitz, he was not happy. He wanted him to be my only date. He didn't want to be fooling around with anybody else.
And Scott brings up a very interesting point, because sometimes when John and Bob Ressler would interview incarcerated predators in prison, they would say, who else are you interviewing? For instance, when he interviewed Gary Trapnell at Joliet in Illinois, and he said, well, I'm also interviewing Joseph Paul Franklin, the racist and anti-Semitic serial killer. And Trapnell was really offended. He said, this guy's an idiot. I mean, he's nothing. Why do you want to talk to him? He's not going to tell you anything. He's not intelligent like I am.
Mm-hmm.
That's very similar to what happened with me with BTK when he found out about Berkowitz. Even though I knew that he was jealous of Berkowitz and the notoriety that the Son of Sam had received in New York and national and international media, when he found out that I was corresponding with Berkowitz, he said, why bother with him? He's not even a man. He's a shooter. Real killers strangle. Like I do. He had such disdain. Or expressed such disdain. But I suspect it was really out of jealousy.
Scott, do you think he was jealous of the fact that New York was such a bigger media venue than Wichita, Kansas?
Absolutely. And in fact, in one of his letters in 1978, he said, what do I have to do to get a little national attention? He literally said national attention. So he wasn't satisfied with the Wichita media.
Mark, one of the other things I'm interested about, as far as, the Mindhunter book and the series, and when you guys were developing it and writing it, how did you think it was going to turn out? Like the game plan when you were going to do it, and what was the goal did you want to really reveal the inner workings of these serial killers' minds? To make it more, actually show people a roadmap on the way they're thinking, or were you just interested in the crimes? I mean, what was the overall goal?
Well, the overall goal was to tell what we thought was a very interesting story, which at the time was not well known about this particular tool in crime detection and criminal investigative analysis. We decided right from the beginning a couple of things. Number one, we weren't going to give away any techniques that might actually help an offender or a potential offender. Second of all, we were going to absolutely personalize every victim, because it's the victims who are really important. And then we wanted to show the techniques, I think. And again, it all comes down to the fascination, which I think most of us have who follow true crime, which is, why do people do the things they do? And we wanted to show that aspect too. Plus, mystery stories, particularly real ones, are inherently interesting. And while profiling is not an end into itself, it's a very interesting dimension that can reveal things that other forms of scientific or forensic investigation or basic detective work can't reveal.
What were some of the commonalities based upon all of John's experiences, that when you wanted to put them down on paper in a book, that you saw that the qualities that these individuals had that made them a serial killer?
Yeah, well, I think we've alluded to some of them already. First of all, whatever the hard wiring is that makes them very aggressive or resentful, together with a really bad background and upbringing, this absolute sense of inadequacy and grandiosity going together. Almost all of them are men, as we've talked about, and whatever their sexual paraphilia was. I mean, all of these crimes are sexually based in some way. Even somebody like David Berkowitz, who never had any physical contact with his victims, you can see that the power of using this Charter Arms 44 Magnum gun, that's a very sexual thrill. I would maintain that a lot of the use of guns is a phallic extension in some ways. One of the things that was very interesting about Berkowitz, which I'm sure Scott found out too when he talked to him, is long before Berkowitz was a serial killer, he was a serial arsonist. I mean, he set many fires. And what he said is he would set the fire, and then he would watch. And once he saw his power in doing that, in bringing the police and bringing the fire department and bringing all the crowds. He would stand in the back of the crowd and masturbate. I mean, this was a huge sexual thrill for him. Mm-hmm. And I suspect he did the same thing after his killings. And what's interesting is all his killings were the same. They were always a man and a woman in the same car. And what does he do? He doesn't go to the man's side of the car, which is you would think is the primary threat. He goes to the woman's side of the car, and that's where the first shot takes place. That's very significant, I think.
You bring up such an important point. That sex is generally involved in some way. It is not necessarily the primary motivation. Like with Jeffrey Dahmer, I mean, his killings definitely were hedonistic, sexual killings. But both Berkowitz and Rader had a sexual component, but it wasn't the primary motive. It was almost after the fact, but there was still a sexual component to it.
Right. And the sexual component does not have to involve rape or penetration or anything like that.
Great point.
The sex is all going on in the mind.
Exactly. And both Berkowitz and Rader, at the expense of being a little bit, voracious masturbators. Yep. And Rader would do just that after the killing. He would watch his crime scene, and he would then, pleasure himself at the crime scene.
And then afterwards, when he had his drawings, and some of which involved, as you say, cut and paste from newspapers and magazines, that would be his souvenir of the crime, in addition to whatever else he took.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, because usually when there are people thinking about serial killers and kind of attributes as they're growing up, I mean, I don't know if BTK fell into this category, but we know Gary Ridgway did. I mean, he used to torture animals when he was younger. He had a really, really strange sexual fantasy relationship with his mother, to the point where when, his mother was on her deathbed, and when she died, he had sex with her in the hospital room. So it's like, those are some of the things that, and the other question I have for you is all of the work that you've done, all the work that the exposure of talking about and analyzing, and the amount of fiction that has been generated by serial killers, is it making it hard to be a serial killer in today's age?
No, I don't think so. We don't seem to have the showbiz type serial killers these days, the ones who get the big names. I think it's still going on. I mean, the FBI's estimate is there's anywhere between 35 and 50 serial killers operating at the same time. And, I don't think this is a new phenomenon either. I think we've often suspected that a lot throughout history, we think of Jack the Ripper as being sort of ground zero for serial killers in 1888. But when you think about it, I think a lot of the things over the centuries that were attributed to witches and werewolves and vampires, they were probably serial killers of their own era.
Absolutely. And I've frequently gotten the question, I'm sure you two have as well, Mark, is, what magically happened in the 70s and 80s that now serial killers are all, everywhere. And I think part of it was that the technology was being developed at that time to even identify and track serial killers. And until I think it's usually Ressler who is given credit for using the term serial killer for the first time in that context. It's like, if you have the tools to excavate and find something, you will find it. And that started to happen in the 70s.
I think that's very true. I mean, one of the things which the FBI will say from time to time is, if you really want to screw up an investigation, drag a body over a county line or something like that. I mean, we've had so many cases that I could cite where you would have a serial killer operating in 2 contiguous counties or 3 contiguous counties, and the local police would not know about the crimes in the other counties because they didn't have the tools to correlate them. So yeah, I think there are probably a lot more that didn't get identified as serial killers before, say, the 1970s.
Yeah. Well, this has been fascinating.
Well, Scott knows he can call on me anytime. So
that's
Thank
great.
You so much.
Mark,
this has been wonderful.
This is so much fun. I really enjoyed this. It's so good seeing you and so good chatting with you.
Me too.
And we're hoping to see Mindhunter 3 soon.
We certainly are. Yes.
That'd be great. So And so we appreciate all your time and your expertise. And
thank you so much, Mark. It was a pleasure to meet you.
Take care, everybody.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye, Mark.
Next time on Partners in True Crime.
I didn't really expect any of that to come from this life, the writing, the speaking, finding out I could help people, educate, like train future criminologists. All of that is insane to me that that's come out of this, all these positive things.
All rights reserved. This has been a production of 722 Media Content.